The state seal gleamed in the sunlight, and for a moment, I felt like I was holding not just history, but permanence. Something no HOA, no forged letter, no temporary board majority could take. I installed it just above the front steps where my dad used to hang a wind chime. Now it caught the light instead of the breeze, and that felt just right. A few days later, I noticed a strange SUV parked across the lake road. The windows were tinted, and no one stepped out. It stayed there for about 15 minutes before it pulled off and drove away. I thought maybe it was a lost visitor, but a sinking feeling told me it was Karen. She'd gone quiet, yes, but quiet didn't mean gone. And I knew her well enough to suspect she'd eventually return, if only to see how badly the world had moved on without her. The next day, that suspicion was confirmed. I received a final letter, handwritten, no envelope, left under a rock near the mailbox. The paper was stiff, written in Karen's dramatic cursive. It wasn't an apology. Of course not. It was more like a farewell. She wrote that she hoped the community remembered what it once was, before the circus, before personal vengeance masquerading as justice. She said she had moved on to another place, somewhere with greater respect for order. I read it twice. Then I folded it in half and dropped it into the fire pit without a word. And just like that, she was officially gone. Her house went up for sale 2 weeks later, and sold surprisingly fast. Apparently, someone from out of state thought the lake view was worth ignoring the lingering neighborhood drama. Brad's name never came up again, not once, and I wasn't about to ask. The fence stayed, a quiet divider, now weathered slightly and giving off a kind of rustic charm. Every once in a while, I'd catch tourists taking pictures of it. I didn't mind. In fact, I found myself retelling the story to new neighbors who moved in and wondered what the legend was behind the famous split cabin. They always laughed in disbelief, and I always ended the same way, saying Karen gave me no choice but to draw the line she thought didn't exist. The cabin changed after all of it, not in structure but in feeling. I cleaned up the old toolshed, reorganized the storage loft, and restored the fireplace that had sat unused for years. I brought in a new couch, a gift to myself, but I left my dad's old recliner right where Brad had once sat like he owned the place. I repaired the armrests, polished the wood, and made it a centerpiece again. Everything that had once been disrupted was returned to its rightful state, only now with a story behind it. One that lived not just in memory, but in law, in the community, and in the wood grain of the fence itself. Autumn crept in slowly. The lake reflected golden trees, and crisp wind carried the scent of pine and firewood. One Saturday morning, I walked out onto the dock with a thermos of coffee and watched the mist rise off the water. I could see a few early fishing boats out in the distance, and the muffled laughter of families drifting across the surface. Life had returned to normal, not just in routine but in rhythm. Peace wasn't a moment anymore, it was a state, a default. Earned, not given. I'd spent months defending a cabin, but what I'd really been protecting was my father's legacy, my right to grieve without intrusion, and my place in a community that had once tried to push me out with rules, signatures, and fake authority. And by refusing to back down, by using the system to outmaneuver the system, I didn't just win. I changed the rules for everyone else too. I thought about that more than I admitted. How something so personal became so public, how a small act like building a fence could ripple through a neighborhood and leave things better than they were. There were no more threats, no more fake citations, no sudden appearances from law enforcement or drones surveying my land. Just quiet mornings, long afternoons, and a house that stood proudly on land that was now protected by something stronger than an HOA clause: truth, documentation, and stubborn love. That was the word I kept coming back to. Love. For my father. For this land. For the life he built and left in my hand. Karen never understood that. She saw property as leverage, as control. I saw it as a bond. And no matter how many letters she wrote or tantrums she threw, she could never erase that. As the wind picked up and scattered orange leaves across the yard, I looked up at the sign by the porch, then back down the center line of the cabin where the fence once ran through the living room. I had removed that part entirely, but in my head it was still there. Not as a wall, but as a story etched into the foundation. And I knew that long after I was gone, someone else would see the little plaque, read the landmark sign, and wonder about the man who split his cabin in two to prove a point. And maybe, just maybe, they'd understand. You don't protect what you love with rage. You protect it with patience, paperwork, and just enough petty precision to remind the world that you're not someone to be pushed.